it's interesting to think through these things, I think, for a lot of gun owners, because traditionally, gun owners the culture has been very pro law enforcement. And there are these tensions between making law enforcement as easy as possible and keeping your rights intact. That's obviously something that's always been in tension, and it's fascinating to watch. You could look at a group like the National Rifle Association, right? And they're very strongly supportive of law enforcement, of course, and they have a lot of law enforcement programs. They're hesitant to critique law enforcement in these situations, frankly. I don't believe they've said anything about Amir Locke to my memory, although people can correct me if I'm wrong on that point. They never said anything officially about Philando Castile either. It seems there is quite a lot of support for law enforcement, of course. I mean, my grandfather was a police officer for his entire career. And, you have this affinity towards law enforcement. It's certainly in certain segments of the gun rights movement. You certainly have other segments that are more prioritize civil rights protections over the goodwill of police officers, I guess. I don't know if that's the right way to phrase this, right. But how do you see that tension between an inherent respect for law enforcement and the concern over the violation of gun rights? And how do you reconcile those two things? How do you, right. I mean, maybe you can't completely, right? And this is probably true for all civil rights, trying to balance against the interest of law enforcement. But I mean, how do you get to that point?
Well, if you go back, to the 1990s, the gun rights community wasn't so sort of reflexively pro law enforcement, right? I mean, you had when the ATF was conducting raids on gun owners, you had the NRA and other groups were vocally speaking out against aggressive law enforcement tactics, exactly like the kinds that we're talking
Jack
about.
Booted Thugs comment.
The Jack
that was
Booted
a
Thugs,
huge
right?
political problem for them, right? Wasn't
and
it?
you had G. Gordon Liddy on his talk show advising gun owners to shoot for the head, right? when the police raid your house. And I'm not advocating that.
I mean, you still have some of that rhetoric in certain quarters, of course, about police infringements, and it's not. I don't want to say that there's no one strongly pushing back against these things. It's just there's clearly in our gun culture a priority put on respect for law enforcement in the mainstream gun rights movement in large part.
Well, and I think and I think that's I think the NRA. I think the NRA has actually been on the wrong side of gun rights a lot. I mean, the NRA opposed the Heller case all the way up until it got to the Supreme Court, right? They did not want that case. That Heller was brought by a group of sort of libertarian gun rights activists in Washington, D.C. I think the NRA has become more of a culture war organization than a gun rights organization. And one example I always bring up is Colin Kaepernick. Colin Kaepernick was a gun owner before all of this started happening, before the whole take a knee thing. And, I think it was a huge missed opportunity for gun rights groups to find common ground with, the Black community, particularly Black athletes. A lot of Black athletes are gun owners. But a lot of Black athletes also, endure or have experienced racism at the hands of law enforcement. And I think there was, the NRA decided for whatever reason to make Colin Kaepernick sort of a public enemy. Even though he had never said anything disparaging about gun owners or gun rights, and probably, I would imagine, supports gun rights, given that he owned a gun. There's, he had video on his Instagram of him at the shooting range. And so I think, the NRA decided, probably because, as you mentioned, they have a huge law enforcement contingent among its membership, that they were going to sort of take a side in this issue that really had nothing to do with gun rights. And if anything, I think, civil rights and gun rights are one and the same. I mean, I don't think you can necessarily separate them, particularly if you look at, the history of gun control in this country and the way it's been sort of imposed on the Black community. I think that law enforcement, I would agree that police officers have a difficult job. I agree that their job is probably made more difficult by the fact that almost half of U.S. households do own a gun. But I also think that, as a staunch libertarian, I don't think that our rights are contingent on how convenient it is of the government to abide by them or to respect them, right? That our rights exist no matter how difficult it is for the government to enforce and respect those rights. And so we can't just say we're going to dispense with the Fourth Amendment and the Castle Doctrine because it's just too difficult to have both that and the Second Amendment,
Right.
and it just makes it too difficult for law enforcement.
Yeah.
I understand the tension there, but I don't think we give up our rights because it's inconvenient.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's a lot to this that we're not going to be able to cover in one podcast. But obviously, there's
Right.
the NRA is at butts heads with law enforcement in certain circumstances, right? And more, for instance, constitutional carry or permitless carry. You have a lot of police groups that are opposed to that for basically the same reasons. It makes it harder for police to arrest people they suspect of being criminals because it takes away a charge of carrying without a permit, even if they don't have evidence of any other crime. And so, certainly the NRA is not completely, beholden to law enforcement's interest. And there is obviously a very big split within law enforcement itself, generally between like big city law enforcement groups and more rural, like sheriff's groups. You see that too. There's a huge cultural difference, and their views on
And
guns
rank and file officers,
hugely divergent as well. So there's a lot of interesting stuff to get into, and the NRA is not the only gun rights group that is very supportive of law enforcement, and you have other groups like the Firearms Policy Coalition, for instance, which has taken a more aggressive civil libertarian approach to the law enforcement. So there's a myriad of different issues at play that
Absolutely.
we can't get into completely.